Hi, this is Roy Samuelson. You know those conversations that stay with you? And it's not because it's like super over the top, but it was honest. And that's what this one is. Connor Scott-Gardner works with blind and visually impaired young people in Sussex, England. He also represents the UK on international Braille committees and presents at the European Parliament and has appeared at South by Southwest. But this whole conversation, what struck me wasn't just his credibility and his resume, it's the way he talks about work. It's very specific and it's very careful and it's not overpromising. He told me he's fallen into the trap of pointing out everything wrong without offering anything to move forward. And I think most of us in accessibility spaces understand that and have seen that and maybe even been a part of that. He also talks about why awareness on its own has a cap. There's a certain point where awareness isn't going to fix the thing. And what he thinks sits on the other side of awareness. And we also get into what it actually looks like to truly support a young blind person well. And this isn't theory, it's actual practice in a room with a person whose electricity bills are arriving in a format they can't read. And we also talk about leadership. This is so much fun. This is part one of two conversations. By the end of this one, you'll understand why part two is going to be coming soon. Thanks for being here. As always, this is for Kevin. Welcome to the ADNA Presents. Today we have Connor Scott-Gardner joining us. Gardner has led the 16-plus youth service at Blatchington Court Trust, supporting blind and visually impaired young people through structured casework, community events, and a youth forum he's building to develop future blind leaders. In the first 6 months, he designed and implemented a new casework system that measures confidence and access across key life areas. And so what that does is help target support and trackable outcomes and surfacing patterns in this unmet need that shape the service itself. All those words mean Connor knows what he's doing. So beyond that, Connor also represents the UK on the European Blind Union Braille Working Group and the International Council on English Braille Membership Committee, and is part of the World Blind Union and ICEVI Joint Research Project on Global Braille Use. I'm assuming that Connor still has the same 24 hours that the rest of us have per day. I don't understand. We might get into that. He sits on the Vocal Eyes User Panel and the Goalball UK EDI Committee and volunteers with the Braillists Foundation. So we can cover a gamut in this conversation. One of the other final things that I'd love to mention, he's also presented at the European Parliament, Westminster, South by Southwest 2023, and the 2025 Tactile Reading and Graphics Conference in Amsterdam. His media work includes The Guardian, BBC News, Sky News, and Radio 1 In Touch. Let's add the ADNA Presents to this list. Wow, I'm overwhelmed. What do you think? What's that like to hear all those things together? You've been doing this for so long, Connor.
Yeah, it's kind of weird in a way because I feel just like a normal person, right? I go to work and then I come home and I go to the gym and I'm tired all the time. And then I'm often like, oh, I haven't done anything. And then I look at that list and I'm like, oh, I've actually done some stuff. But I think it's that thing, often people say, oh, you've done loads of cool things. And actually sometimes it's not that I haven't, but sometimes things just come along, right? And I don't really
Sure.
know how it happens.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, like, when you're moving this fast, let's think about that casework system that
Mm.
taking half a year, learning how things work. What were you trying to fix there?
So I came into a really new job and I wasn't taking over the job from someone else. And I think that's really key. I came in to lead a service that was kind of new. And the organization I work for has always worked with blind and visually impaired young people. But the way the services are configured was quite new when I joined. And so I had a lot of control over what I was doing. Um, but also there were very clear areas where I needed to be supporting young people. I also needed to make sure that I was working out the things they needed from me. And sometimes I would go into these conversations with young people because there was so much going on in their lives. I could say
Mm,
to them, okay, what do you need support with? And they might say housing. But actually, when you dig into a conversation, you realize they don't get any of their letters in a format they can access. So none of their electricity bills are ever electronic or that they're always in standard print, or they receive letters from the health service, but in standard print rather than in Braille or whatever format they want. And these are things that people wouldn't necessarily think to say, but are things we can work on. And
Mm.
so I kind of thought about, okay, what are the areas that people need to have met in their life? So that's things like access to finances, access to healthcare, access to vision rehabilitation training where that's necessary, access to a social life and to education and employment. And these are really big areas, but I kind of looked broadly and thought, okay, what does everybody need? And for the young people I work with, it's going to be slightly different for all of them. Some have very complex, multiple disabilities. And we're looking at things like, how do I support in a conversation with their parents to get them a long-term placement where they can live? But broadly speaking, everyone needs access to certain basic things, irrespective of disability. And so it really helped me to steer the kind of work I'm doing with people.
It's great to hear about that approach of finding those different, I guess, similarities and differences. Like you said, there's an
Mm,
intersectionality of different
yeah.
approaches for different people. And I'm thinking also about that work seems to seamlessly prepare you to speak to the audiences. Like we mentioned the European Parliament, South by
Mm,
Southwest and
mm.
Westminster. When you prepare to speak to those organizations, how do you know that your message is landing? Is it as simple as awareness, or what are some results that you're really proud of?
That's so tricky. I think awareness is good, but we need to move beyond it. We
Mm,
talk a lot about things like Blindness Awareness Month, for example.
sure.
I think that everyone knows that blind people exist, right? It's sort of, but what they don't do is treat blind people with the same respect that they maybe treat sighted people, or they don't think blind people should have access to the same things. Or even if they say, oh, yeah, of course, blind people should have an education and blind people should be employed, how many of those people would be willing to give a blind person a job? So I think how I look at it is we've got to move beyond awareness into some kind of action. But I also think it's really easy to get into a mindset with activism where you just tell everyone the things they're doing wrong and you don't actually give them any kind of solutions. And I've definitely fallen into that trap before where you say, actually, you're excluding this group of people, or you're not doing this, or you're not doing that, or the language you use is wrong. But what you're not doing is saying, these are the kinds of things you could do or you should do. And I hope that over the last few years, I've moved more towards, yes, I do point out things that I think are wrong, but I also talk about the kind of support we do need and the kind of systems that do need to be in place. And so, for example, so a big part of my job is running events, for example, running social events. And I recently wrote a LinkedIn post where I said, if there's one thing you're going to do when you plan an event, it's write an accessibility statement. And don't just say this event is accessible for everyone, because it probably isn't. The events
Mm.
I run are not accessible for every single person on the planet because everyone has such different access needs and there are some really conflicting access needs. But I think when you're clear about something like, okay, the event has 2 steps to get into it, actually, that probably means it's not accessible for a lot of wheelchair users, but it might be accessible for some disabled people, whereas 3 flights of stairs wouldn't be. And so it's just giving really clear, specific information. And I think that when we do this kind of work and when we are offering solutions as much as pointing out a barrier, hopefully we can create some change. Yeah, I would like to think that some of the work I've done has changed people's minds. I guess the thing I'm most proud of, though, in answer to your question, is I led a campaign when the RNIB, which is the Royal National Institute of Blind People, decided that they were going to permanently close their personal transcription service. And so it used to be that you could send in documents, pieces of music, whatever it was, and get them transcribed into Braille. So into Braille music or into literary Braille, or you could get a tactile map if you needed that. And they decided they were going to close that service. And actually, I said, yes, there may only be a small number of people who need this, but for those people, that is access to information we don't otherwise have. And we did, in the end, get that reversed. So there is still access to that service. And I think that's a result I'm proud of because although it's on a much smaller scale than like speaking to Parliament and things, I think it's a result that has I can see a real benefit for this community in a way that maybe some of the bigger policy work is really important, but you're kind of playing the long game with that as opposed to getting, an immediate change.
Sure. And I can hear the joy and also hear the smile in your voice, thinking
Mm,
about
mm,
the cascade effect that that long game is
right.
going to bring so much more benefits because of that access that's going to lead to innumerable things. I'm thinking about that
Yeah.
mentorship too, but that obviously you're mentoring the at your job and then also mentoring, let's call it beyond accessibility in the sense of just building awareness. That what a great example that you shared about the RNIB. I'm thinking about live audio description when sighted people engage with blind audiences, whether that's as volunteers or helpers.
Mm.
What's that line between what is, let's call it useful, and something else? And how is that line crossed publicly?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I suppose the line is agency, really. It's about letting the blind person determine what is and isn't useful. So often I find I have sort of unwanted help thrust upon me. And I would say that's not useful because there's no consideration of my needs as a blind person, or maybe that I don't need anything in that situation. I think where we can kind of coexist very peacefully together is for a sighted person to say, actually, what do you need? But also for a blind person to not just expect the sighted person to be there to assist at all times. I've certainly witnessed relationships where a sighted person is kind of viewed as only useful for their vision. I think that's not healthy either. Neither side of this is good. It has to be kind of mutual give and take. And we're not going to do everything right all the time. But I think if we go into it with an open mind, then we get a lot further than we otherwise would have.
I love it. I'm thinking about the all or nothing thinking that can sometimes happen,
Mm,
specifically with sighted people bringing a very specific intent from their perspective.
mm,
And when a blind or low vision person is approached in that context, that lack of agency really becomes clear. And I can imagine that, let's call the word relationship, that relationship, whether it's a 2 second greeting of saying, "Hi, I'm Roy," or whatever that specific question is, to a long term kind of professional relationship, maybe at the working environment, or even other relationships, that kind of communication. I love that you said both ways, that can really help, I guess, get into those, let's call it nooks and crannies, maybe those spaces
mhm,
that
mhm.
might not be very clear to people.
Yeah, I think it's really about just trying to build that understanding and mutual respect, I suppose.
Well, speaking of respect, this pathway for blind leaders, the youth forum,
Mm, mm,
what would it look like for that to be one of the best places, like let's say Sussex, to be one of the
mm,
best
mm.
places for a blind young person? And what's in the way of that?
I think that, oh, as with anything, we're seeing, certainly in the UK, funding being cut all the time, and that's at a governmental level. So I think it's hard for young people now because the education system is chronically underfunded. And so for any young person, particularly a young blind person, getting access to the kind of support that's needed is so difficult these days. And I definitely see that a lot with people I work with, where they do need access to things and actually that access just isn't being given. In terms of what would need to happen, I mean, I think there is only so much that any organization can change because what we don't have is control over the local or national government.
Mm,
So you can only do so much, right? But what
mm,
I think is that when young blind people are given opportunities, and education is a huge part of this, but outside of education as well, because I know some really well educated blind people who struggle in the outside world and in employment and all these other things because actually they've never had any other opportunities either. They
mm.
may have done really well in education, but what they don't have is leadership experience and they don't have, they've never been required to use their initiative or to think critically and to do these things. So I think there are multiple pieces, and the piece maybe I can have some control over is how do I find ways of giving younger blind people the kinds of leadership experiences I benefited from. And even if it's not the same and in the same situation, because we all have really unique life experiences, and I'm not trying to simulate the life I had, but to say, actually, I really benefited from being allowed to try things and being allowed to be not very good at things and develop those leadership skills in the way young sighted people aren't perfect leaders the first time they start leading something. You don't suddenly become this kind of amazing, perfect leader instantly, but because that's not realistic. But what can happen is that when a young person is given the chance to lead a group and to try things, they then build those skills over time. And that's what I really want for the young people I work with, is to have those opportunities to try things and to lead a group, and to have something that when they're older, they can say at a job interview or wherever it is, they go, oh yeah, I've done this and I've done this and I had this opportunity, and these are the results of what I've done. Because that's how they get ahead in future, is by having those things and by being really successful. But that can't start once they've graduated university. It has to happen before then, if possible.
Beautiful. And I love that distinction between education and skills building. I can only imagine that it might feel like a gym, like going to work out and testing this new muscle
Yeah.
of leadership skills. Is that
Mhm.
a fair track?
I think so. I think it doesn't happen overnight. You don't become a good leader instantly. I don't think anyone is born a perfect leader. I think some people naturally have the upbringing that sets them up in the right way, or then naturally have the right kind of personality. There are people who are naturally more charismatic than others, people who naturally are very calm, and on all these different qualities, right? But I do think leadership is something you can learn. And I would say I'm not a natural leader. I don't feel very confident when I'm required to actually lead something. I think I'm very good at the groundwork behind
Mm.
it and the planning and the organizing and that side of things. But actually, if I'm up in front of a room, I can deliver a speech. If I'm at a conference, that's fine. But
Uh-huh.
actually being required to mobilize people and get people to care about the things I care about, I don't think it's a quality I naturally have, but it is something I've got better at over the years by doing it more. And that's what needs to happen.
Oh, I love that answer. Thanks for sharing that. Earlier, you had said about your experience locally. I'm wondering if there's a difference when you think globally. We mentioned the World Blind Union, the research project, the European Blind Union Braille Working Group, the international presentations that you've done as a speaker. Is there a difference when you move between that global message versus something a little more geographically intimate?
I think so, absolutely. I think what I would say is that locally, I can kind of drill down into the specifics of what's happening in the environment. So I know that local environment really well, and I can talk about very specific policies or very specific areas. When you're working globally, there are so many things at play. So you've got the fact that every country does things differently. You have cultural expectations. You have cultural attitudes towards disability. We're talking in a disability context. And you have to respect that. So you have to push for disability rights and disability access. And I always look to like the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That is a universal sort of standard for what we should have. But equally, there are also different ways that individual people and individual cultures view disability, and the ways disabled people view themselves globally, which are different. So I think there's an element of being sensitive to that, and also not expecting the barriers to be the same. So we can talk, in England, for example, a barrier is not every bus system has audio announcements, and that is a problem. But if you're talking about rural places in other countries, they may not even have any public transport at all. So if you're saying, okay, the barrier blind people face is this, and they're saying, well, actually, blind people are getting no education and aren't able to leave their houses at all, we're talking completely different
Yeah.
barriers. And so we might say, okay, in the UK, the problem is blind people don't get a good enough education because they don't get given the assistive technology they need. That's valid and that's true. Another country might say, well, we don't have electricity in our classrooms. So there's no point in talking about assistive tech because actually, how would we even power it?
Mm.
And that's the kind of landscape globally. So it's a completely different conversation. I think sometimes, and I definitely fall foul of this too. I think particularly very Western disability rights activists can kind of come into a situation and say, these are the problems disabled people face, and I'm an authority on disability, and I know all of this, I know all of this. And actually, we don't know because we are still existing within a very specific context. and within very specific issues. So I'd say, globally, there's an element of actually what can we push for? And what we can push for is legal protection,
Mm.
because whilst some of us already have legal protection to varying degrees in our countries, actually we can say, there's this universal standard. Disabled people should have access to this. They should have a legal right to this. And how that's implemented is going to look so different in different countries, and the barriers to implementation will be different. But we can and we should talk about human. I think you can't have disability advocacy without human rights.
Yeah. What a global answer for a global question. That's very
Yeah.
clear. Thank you. I'd love to shift to something that you have some very clear and important opinions to share. When sighted people document their interactions with blind people publicly,
Mm.
you had a very specific post recently about some social media videos that had gone out about the ways that sighted people were almost platforming themselves in the service of what they were doing. Would you feel comfortable talking with our audience about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely.
And we'll be back later for part 2 of this conversation. Thanks for joining us.